If you're masturbating to pornography and the consequence of that is an immediate influx of guilt, I think that it isn't good for the women who are involved in it, and it's not good for young men because it gives you access to something, gives you access to part of something, but denies you access to all of it. And I think it's dangerous because of that, because it offers immediate gratification, but it offers immediate gratification, but no medium to long-term development of character or life. I guess that's it. And that seems to be a dangerous kind of trap. And the other thing is that it's also, and Norman has talked about this, Dr. Deutsch, we don't know what that kind of massive exposure to multiple virtual sex partners and does to the development of sexual behavior and sexual gratification and sexual impulse and relationship in young men at all. Sexual shame is there for a reason, and it's not a trivial reason. And it's not just going to go away because we may wave the magic wand and make the patriarchal oppressor vanish, and that's not going to happen either, by the way. So if you're ashamed about your sexual behavior, then you have to ask yourself, is the shame wrong or is the sexual behavior wrong? And I'm asking you, I'm not judging your behavior, because what the hell do I know about you? And I have enough trouble with my own behavior, so this is on you. Is your shame what you should be dispensing with, or the behavior? And it might be a little of column A and a little of column B, because life is never simple. But if you don't feel ennobled by your porn-related masturbation, then perhaps that means it's of questionable utility. I certainly don't see it as a stabilizing social force. I don't see it as something people do in public and brag about. Thornhill believed that the liberalism of the 60s was a consequence, at least in part, and in large part, I should say, of the hygienic revolution of the previous 6 decades and more that enabled us to reduce the impact, at least in the West, of infectious diseases. And because we were much less prone to the transmission and receipt of infectious diseases, we could afford to be more liberal by the 1960s. So we got more sexually liberal. And what happened? AIDS. And I say that without prejudice. And what's the most effective means of facilitating the reproduction of a deadly virulent agent and its propagation through the population? If you're masturbating to pornography and the consequence of that is an immediate influx of guilt, to ask yourself who's in control. And that's a really important question, who's in control. That's what terrified me about developing some psychoanalytic acumen, because once you realize that you're a house that many spirits can and do inhabit, and that many of them aren't you, and that many of them aren't working towards the purposes you might want yourself to be working to. And that's the realization of the myth that you're embodying from the Jungian perspective. It's a very, very serious question. The fundamental human myth is Cain versus Abel. And so who are you? Are you Cain or Abel? Well, the answer is you're both. And then the question is, well, who's got the upper hand? And then the next question is, who do you want to have the upper hand? Is it God and Abel or Satan and Cain? And that's a question that's just as germane to non-believers as it is to believers. And isn't that remarkable and appalling and overwhelming and terrifying all at the same time, if you have any sense of what it means? So if your behavior is embarrassing you, well, there's only 2 possibilities, isn't there? You shouldn't be so embarrassed. And I suppose the voice that says yes to all expression of human sexuality would say that your guilt and shame is merely the detrimental hangover of an oppressive patriarchy that's judgmental in its attitudes towards sexuality. Well, what would you use judgment to differentiate if it isn't sexuality? So I don't think that argument goes anywhere. You have to consult your own conscience. I know the conscience can become an oppressive force on its own. That's the indwelling of the great tyrant, and Freud made much of that, a too oppressive superego. And I've certainly seen clients whose expression of healthy sexuality was inhibited by a too rigid superego. That can definitely happen. But that doesn't mean that all guilt about all forms of sexual expression constitutes a superego run amok. And I think repeatedly engaging in a behavior that you judge yourself to be morally reprehensible is a form of performative contradiction, which is the acting out of a lie. And I suspect you know that, or you wouldn't be asking the question. And so, what should you do with pornography? Well, you know the answer to that, and so does everybody else. Everyone knows it's not good. It's not good for those who produce it. It's not good for those who participate, wittingly or unwittingly, because there's plenty of them, in its production. It's not good for its consumers. One way of maintaining satisfaction with a monogamous partner is to vary what you do with that partner. And if that variation is fueled by your mutual sexual fantasies, and then those fantasies are gratified, then one source of motivation to look elsewhere and potentially blow your whole life up, and that of your partner as well, while doing so, is ameliorated. So Erich Neumann, famous student, Carl Jung, said, don't pretend to be better than you are. Now, he didn't mean don't try to be a moral person, don't try to improve yourself or any of that. He meant don't lie about what you are and maybe you're ashamed of it. Well, maybe you should be, but maybe you shouldn't be. And I think assuming that those basic moral preconditions that I described earlier are met, then think about it as an elaborated sexual game, as something that you might play in a sophisticated and aware manner with a willing and able partner. There's lots of games you can play to spice up your sexual life. Buy some lingerie, like buy 100 pieces, buy something sexy for your partner to wear, maybe multiple things. Buy whatever you need that you might want to experiment with. You have to introduce that spirit of pretend play that you had when you were a little kid into your sexual life, and then you have many partners in the same person, and put some thought into it. Sex is something that sex is a domain in which expertise can be developed just like any other domain. And some of that's play and fantasy play and all of that. And some of it's sexual technique. And I guess then the other thing I would say is take stock of each other and see if there are things that you could do in your life that would make you more attractive to one another. Those are hard questions, because no one wants to say, well, I'd be more attracted to my wife sexually if she just acted X way. And the same with regards to a wife's contemplation of her husband. But people are really complicated. You're way more complicated than anything else except another person. What we try to do to understand ourselves is limit what we'll do. And you do that to other people too. Say, well, I know you. And then you punish them if they do things you don't understand. And that way they stay in the box you put them in. And there's a downside to that and an upside. It's part of the social contract not to do outrageous things, although you could. One size doesn't fit all, right? So you have to be aware of how you differ. Mm-hmm. And that does take a long time to figure out who you are, because you're complicated. Mm-hmm. So it might not be that surprising at all that it took you till your mid-30s before you started to have some sense of who you really were, because people are very hard to understand. You probably shouldn't initiate anything that you wouldn't talk to the person about, because what that might mean is that you don't know them well enough to go that far with them physically. And there's dangers in that. You outlined some of them, sex is powerful, and it can, especially when you're inexperienced, it can hurt you, and the hurt can be, long-term or permanent. And that's kind of what you're relating. And so one of the things that I might suggest is that when you initiate the next relationship, that I'm not saying that this is an easy thing to do, because it's not, but there's nothing wrong with not moving forward sexually until you've been able to discuss what you're like personally in relationship to sexual behavior, because you might say, well, maybe you shouldn't be engaging in intimate behavior with a person before you can tell them the story about what happened to you in the South Pacific, and lay out your personal history and be comfortable with that.